This is The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. Over our 12-episode season, I will share some of my best sweater knitting techniques with you while we knit a sweater together. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 4. Today, we're going to talk all about the body, and we're going to talk about casting on a lot of stitches. We're going to talk about alternating skeins, slipping the first stitch, and our integrated button bands. But first, I'd love to know how your first sleeve went. I'm really happy with mine. Da-da-da-da-da. Oh, I'm so happy. I love the color, I love the fabric, I love the subtle variations of a hand dye, and I'm really happy with it. The one thing is I forgot completely that I wasn't getting row gauge, so I followed the directions exactly on this sleeve in terms of number of rows. And so I'm telling you that now to let you know it's okay. There are ways we can fix this. I may have to reknit this sleeve because it is a little bit longer than the suggested length, but I'm gonna knit the second sleeve when I do it by length rather than by number of rows, because in the pattern I say number of rows, but that means I'm expecting that you're getting row gauge, right? And you may not be getting row gauge. I'm not getting row gauge, and I didn't follow my own instructions. But anyway, that's okay. I'm gonna do the second sleeve, and then we will compare, and I will decide which is the right one for me. So, that being said, I need to get my needle back. So I'm going to put the live stitches onto some waste yarn. This is an old pile of acrylic yarn that I had, and it's so I'm going to thread a needle on here. I should say I'm going to thread a sewing needle onto the end of this acrylic yarn, and then I'm just going to slip my stitches over. And right now I'm not going to worry about holding the stitches for the underarms, because the first and last few stitches will be woven together for the underarms rather than being used when we put the sleeves and the body together. So while I'm doing that, let's start thinking about casting on for the body. As you can see, I'm just slipping the stitches over. It's really the easiest, unless you have a lot of the same size needles. Just slipping them onto some waste yarn is a safe way to keep them all together, and then they're not in your way. What I may have neglected to say at the end is, for the sleeves, I break the yarn. For the body, if you're doing the body, try not to break the yarn. It's just because we're going to be starting at the edge of the body for all parts of the sweater, essentially. Once we put the yoke together, we're going to be starting there, so it doesn't make sense to break the yarn for that. But for the sleeves, you can break the yarn. Some people like to leave a long enough tail to do their Kitchener stitch and have fewer ends to weave in. And I get that. I totally get not wanting to weave in more ends than you have to. But at the same time, I do recommend using a separate length of yarn to do your Kitchener stitch, weaving your stitches together at the underarms. I just think having those extra tails gives you a little extra, I don't even want to say fabric, but you can sort of fudge the underarms when we get to them a little if you have some little holes. So I've got my needle free and available, and I've got my yarn, and I am going to cast on a lot of stitches, and that's why the two-tail long-tail cast on is so great. It is perfect, especially for sweater bodies. If you didn't do it for the sleeve, don't worry about it, but for the body, it's awesome, because I have to cast on 222 stitches. That's a lot of stitches. So, but this way I never have to worry about running out of tail. Or the thing that drives me nuts too is to have too long of a tail at the end. And it's too long, it gets in the way, you accidentally knit with it for a few stitches, or maybe a lot of stitches if it's long enough, before you realize you're not knitting with your working yarn. And it's just maddening. So I'm casting on all my stitches. Because I'm talking to you, I'm not really counting, so I'll have to go back and count them and check them. But the other great thing, as I've said, about the two-tail long-tail cast on, especially when working with a hand-dyed yarn, is that we're all set to start alternating skeins right away. And that's the great thing. Like my sleeve, it's so pretty. There are variations in the color because it's a hand dye. It's not perfectly evenly dyed, but you're never getting flashing or pooling, and pooling is when the stripes sort of cluster together, and flashing is just bits of color here and there. But it's a really even, it's not a perfectly flat colored fabric, and that's why I love it. I love a hand dye because there are those variations, but these variations are now sort of spread all over the fabric. So what's going to happen when I get all the way to the end of the cast on is we are going to be able to start with one skein and we'll work 2 rows. So I like to think of it as there and back, and then we're going to switch to the other skein. But because we're doing this integrated button band, I have one extra little trick for you, and that is in the very first row we are going to move both of our working yarn tails over, and we're going to have the button band edge where it meets the body of the cardigan be the place where we switch the yarns. And that allows us to have the nice slip stitch edging, which makes this smooth chain along the fronts. If we weren't doing the integrated button band, it wouldn't really matter. You could switch skeins at the very beginning of each row or every other row. But when we're doing these button bands, we want things to look a little more special, and changing skeins at the end point or the beginning point doesn't make a nice smooth transition. I have no idea how many stitches I have here, but I'm gonna point these out on Jane. So I'm gonna open this up, and you can see that there's this little line along the inside, and that is where I changed the skeins. And I twist, and you will also twist the yarn around each other very gently. Don't pull tight, it'll pucker. You don't want that to happen. But if you consistently twist them, I usually drop the first skein and pick the other skein up from underneath and start working with it. They're twisted together there. Everything is nice and tidy. You don't have to worry about, about anything. It also, later on when we get into the body where it's stockinette on the body and garter stitch on the button band, it tells us exactly where to stop purling. This is usually on the way back, as I call it. On the way back, you know where to stop purling and knit the last 6 stitches because you've come across that other yarn. So it's a great way to remember things without using another stitch marker. I do use a stitch marker, and I recommend placing a stitch marker here for the left-hand button band, and that's when you get down to the other end. So the thing is, you can do the two-tail long-tail cast on even if you're not using a hand-dyed yarn. It's just a great way to ensure that you always have enough yarn for casting on stitches. But if you are using a commercial yarn or a dyed in the fleece yarn where there aren't variations in color, you can break the second skein after you cast on all your stitches. But I don't think you need to alternate skeins if you are using a commercially dyed yarn. The other thing to remember is to not count your slip knot as one of your stitches. Oh my goodness. Okay. So we're going to pretend we've cast on all our stitches, and we're not counting our slip knot. So we've got the right number of stitches. Now we have the two tails of yarn from the 2 different skeins. The first thing we want to do is we want to slip the first stitch so that we're making this lovely chain edge, and we're going to do it up the entire way up to the very end of the sweater. So we better start with row 1. I like to bring the yarn that I'm going to be working with in front of my right needle, you slip the needle in as if to purl, and then you bring the yarn between the needles to the back, and then you're ready to start knitting. And for this very first row, we're going to do this one little fiddly thing. And I really, honestly, I don't like fiddly things, but this is really important and will set you up for the rest of the integrated button bands. So I have, we'll call it skein A for the moment. I've slipped the first stitch with skein A, and I'm going to knit the second stitch with skein A. Then I'm going to knit the third stitch with, oh, hold on. I can do this two-handed. Not very well though. I'm going to knit the the third stitch with skein B. Again, bay. We'll just call it bay. So now we have the 4th stitch with A, the 5th stitch with B, and the 6th stitch with A. So we have 6 stitches for our button band. And now we're going to alternate, and we're going to start knitting the rest of this row with skein bay. So we'll knit all the way across with our B skein. To the end, we will slip the slip knot off. We'll turn, we'll slip the first stitch as if to purl, bring the yarn between the needles to the back. We'll knit back all the way back, right past where we dropped skein A, and to the very end. Then we'll turn our work again, and row 3, we will always change skeins on the odd numbered rows or the right side rows. On your odd rows, you will slip the first stitch, knit 5, then you will let go of the yarn you've been using, switch to the other skein, pick it up from underneath, and proceed on your merry knitting way. Okay, you don't have to worry anymore about switching skeins for those first 6 stitches. We just wanted to alternate the yarn so we could move it over to the change point. So that is how we get going. And then once we are finished with our garter hem, we are going to start doing our buttonholes. Yay! Now, one thing that came up in the forums about this pattern was people were surprised that we were doing 2 buttonholes. Like, wait, did I read that right? Yes, we are doing 2 buttonholes, one on each button band. And there are a number of reasons to do this. One is you will know exactly where to sew on your buttons if you are sewing buttons on at the end, because you will just sew it over the buttonhole. And then that's perfect. You don't have to worry about measuring. You don't have to worry that you're a row off on sewing versus the buttonhole. It's just, it tells you, the sweater will tell you exactly what to do. The other option is you could do something like a shirt stud or a cufflink style button. You could sew 2 buttons together, and then you would just put the second button through both buttonholes. And then you can change your buttons whenever you like. This is also great if you fall in love with a button that can't be washed, because I'm pretty sure every once in a while you are going to want to wash your sweater, right? And if you have a leather button or a wooden button or something delicate that you're worried about that you don't want to wash in whatever way you are washing, it's really easy if you have the buttons just set up to be removed. So, and then you can switch buttons between cardigans. There's all sorts of fun things you can do. You can sew crazy buttons to simple buttons, and you can change them at will, and however you feel like, whatever you feel like wearing that day. Okay, so one other thing, obviously, is the actual buttonhole itself. And the way I do them is a yarn over for the buttonhole, and then obviously we've increased the number of stitches by doing a yarn over, so we need to get rid of a stitch. So then I just do knit 2 together. And I mirror those on the button bands. So on the first one I do knit 2 together, yarn over, and then when you get to the end you do yarn over, knit 2 together. And that's just so they're tidy and very symmetrical. They're easy. I don't fuss with a lot of other stuff. You know, I don't switch from knit together to slip slip knit. You can if you want, but this is such fine yarn that it's just not really obvious in the button band, especially since a button is usually covering up the buttonhole. Okay, so now we're ready to work our first buttonhole. Slip the first stitch, knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over, and knit 2. And now we are ready to switch yarns. So I'm going to put the needle through, let go of yarn skein A, pick up skein B, and I'm just going to call it skein B from now on, and just start knitting. And here I'm going to show you what it looks like on the back. You see that nice, this line of little stitches, and don't pull real tight because you don't want that to pucker. But that's the line where I'm just sort of twisting the stitches around one another. And you can see this is skein A, and now we're working over on skein B. And then you go along, and of course on the right side rows, you'll just keep knitting the stitches. When you get to the other end, and you will place a marker in the very first one, you'll get to the last 6 stitches, place the marker, knit 2 stitches, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 2. And that's your 6-stitch button band on the second side. On the way back, you just do the normal, you slip the first stitch, knit 5, slip the marker, purl all the way over to the point where we're switching yarns. And that's your second marker. You don't need to place another marker for that. And you switch from purling to knit. You knit those 6 stitches, still with the same skein of yarn you've been using for both rows, and then you're done. And then you will knit 6 stitches, continuing with that skein, switch to the other skein, and keep going. For the buttonholes, I recommend going, first of all, figuring out your row gauge, and figuring out the number of rows that corresponds to about 2 inches. I think I give a little bit of information on choosing a different number of buttonholes if you want to alter that. If you're making your sweater longer, you'll want to figure it out. And then after that, you can count, and you'll know the number of garter ridges, and that's a quicker way because a garter ridge is 2 stockinette rows. And so in this case, instead of 16 rows or 8 garter ridges, I'm going to do 18 rows or 9 garter ridges before I do my next buttonhole. And that should, because I'm getting 9 rows per inch instead of 8 rows per inch like in the pattern, that should cover everything that we are worried about. So that's really everything we're going to cover today. Get yourself through the hem, which is just garter stitch, knitting back and forth. You'll get used to switching skeins, and then you'll do your first buttonhole, and you'll start doing the stockinette body portion of the sweater. Next time, we will talk about the shaping. We'll talk about the decreases. I'm using what's called a center double decrease, and we'll talk a lot about that. And then we'll talk about the increase points as well. So next week, it'll be all about the shaping. So hopefully you can get up to the point where we're gonna do the first set of decreases. If not, don't worry. These videos are living on in perpetuity. You can always find them. And so go at your own pace, and don't worry. You don't have to keep up with anybody else. This is your sweater. It's supposed to make you happy. It's supposed to be fun. So thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't posted a project page on Ravelry for your project, please do. We'd love to see how you're doing. And until next time, thanks so much for joining me, and happy knitting. Bye. This is season 1 of The Sweater, and we are knitting the solstice cardi together. Many thanks to Karen at Roundtable Yarns, Natalie at Remembrances Pottery, Corinna at Picnic Knits, Tara Swiger and my fellow Starship captains, and you for being part of this knitting adventure. Don't forget to visit KathleenDames.com/thesweater to sign up for the newsletter before March 25th and get your free copy of the solstice cardi pattern in the welcome email. Is it after March 25th? Purchase your copy of the Solstice Cardi from my Ravelry shop. And be sure to share your project on social media using the hashtags KDSweater and Solstice Cardi. Questions? Comments? Just want to share your progress? Visit the Kathleen Dames Design Ravelry forum for support and camaraderie. Thanks so much for joining me, and happy knitting!